Hello, I'm Stibby, and this is my YouTube channel. I wanted to try to do something for October, so I started playing a bunch of bizarre games you might not have tried type PS2 horror games. And once I started playing Michigan Report from Hell for even a little bit, I knew this was the one that I had to make a video on. I've actually known about the game Michigan Report from Hell for a while now, exclusively because of a YouTube video of the 50 worst pieces of video game voice acting that was featured on the G4 TV show Attack of the Show way back in the day.
Now bear my Arctic blast!
I then forgot about the game, as I did most of the games on that list, until randomly, years later, fairly recently, the game was brought to my attention again as someone referenced it as an early Suda51 title. For anyone who might not know who Suda51 is, he's a weirdo video game developer known for his work on a number of cult classic games. No More Heroes was probably his biggest crossover hit, but people may also be familiar with Lollipop Chainsaw, Killer 7, The Silver Case, Shadow of the Damned, Killer is Dead, or Let It Die. Suda had been involved with the Japanese AA video game market in some capacity since the 90s, but he really blew up in 2007 with No More Heroes to a household name. As for his work on this game, he created the concept for Michigan Report from Hell and worked on the game as a producer. The pitch of this game was based off the Stephen King story The Mist, although monsters were added to make it feel more action-y. So, Michigan Report from Hell is a game about monsters sprouting up all over Chicago, which is also suddenly bathed in a thick mist. And yes, the game takes place mostly in Chicago, which is famously not in Michigan. I think the title comes from the fact that parts of the backstory take place over Lake Michigan, but it is kind of weird to have a game titled Michigan that does not take place in Michigan.
What part of Illinois are you from? Tell the man. Chicago.
You play as an unnamed cameraman who is teamed up at the beginning of the game with a sound guy named Briscoe and star reporter Pamela Martell, who teach you how to play the game. So, what kind of game is Michigan Report from Hell, and how do you play it?
Now then, I'll be teaching you everything you need to know about TV news coverage. Listen up and do exactly as I say.
Michigan Report from Hell is more or less an adventure game, except you only have a limited amount of interactions and have to guide the reporter to perform actions for you. The best comparison I can think of for the gameplay might sound insane, but it's actually Pac-Man 2, where you have to try to corral the main character around instead of just being able to really interact with things yourself. The cameraman in Michigan Report from Hell is a bit more of a character than the godlike stone-throwing presence you play as in Pac-Man 2, and the reporter is a bit more competent than Pac-Man. Actually, the reporter is kind of too competent, and goes basically exactly where they need to go without you having to do much directing. It makes most of the problem solving pretty simple when the reporter goes to the exact door the key you just got opens as soon as you find the key. Aside from puzzle solving, this game also has combat. Kind of. You can point at things and tell the reporter to shoot them. I actually don't hate this system that much. It's fine. It's not like most adventure games are known for their combat, and there isn't that huge a difference between clicking on a guy that your character shoots versus clicking on a guy that someone else shoots. Mostly I would say that combat's presence here mostly seems unnecessary, but again, that's true of most adventure games. But as for what your character can actually do themselves, besides clicking on things for the reporter to use, well, you can look at things and get a little flavor text and sometimes a hint on rare occasions when you have to think about a puzzle solution. There are also a few sections where the reporter doesn't join you, and you can interact with a couple of things. Funnily enough, when you're on your own, your character can only go through doors that are open, which does make it feel like your character doesn't know how to open doors, but it's a fine enough visual cue. You can also ram into stuff, which is used to solve a couple different puzzles, if you can call them that, where you hit things and they open, and it can also be used to annoy the shit out of your colleagues, if you so desire. But the main thing that you as a player do is decide what you are and are not going to film. And you get points throughout the game based on what you decide to film. Those points are sorted into 3 categories and shown on the bar on the top of the screen, which has 2 competing options. Things will either give you points in suspense, which is indicated by an arrow moving towards the S on the right side of the bar. Points in erotic, which is indicated by the same arrow moving towards the E on the left side of the bar, or points in immoral, which is indicated by this brassy rust stuff taking over the bar from the center. You get points in suspense by filming things that have to do with the mystery of the game or things of a supernatural nature. So something like a floating book, or a creepy doll in a doorway, or a note that gives you a clue. In practice, if you are interacting with every interactable object that you see in most playthroughs, most things will give you suspense points. So it's pretty easy to get a high suspense score. Erotic is pretty self-explanatory. You film things that are sexy. In my 2 playthroughs, I got points for a few computer screens set to something scandalous. I found a couple of adult magazines around. And at one point, there's a woman named Justine tied to a billiards table, and you get erotic points every time you interact with her. Although, she only has like 3 lines of dialogue, so if you wanted to farm erotic points, you'd have to just cycle through those over and over again, and I feel like most people will get bored. There are probably other scenes that you can get where you would get erotic points, but I didn't get any of them, so I don't know for sure. There's a lot you can miss in this game. Pretty early on, I realized that there weren't going to be a lot of opportunities to get erotic points, and did actively try to farm them, and I still came nowhere close to the amount of suspense points that I had. Then there's immoral points. I'm not really sure what gives you immoral points in terms of object interactions in the world. I definitely got a few, like, there was a note I read from the trash that gave me some, but how you get the big immoral points is by electing to film people in dire situations instead of trying to help them. The game tells you that these scores impact the game and the overarching story, but really they just move you toward one of 4 different post-credit ending scenes. One for high suspense, one for high erotic, one for high immoral, and one for low immoral. For the actual controls of the game, you have dual analog movement and look. You also have L1 and R1 zoom in and out, and when you get an orange dot on an item, you can press X to interact with it, or for most things, you can also just zoom in on it to trigger the interaction as well. The up and down D-pad buttons are used to crouch, crouch lower, and get back up, which makes a certain type of sense, but it isn't just told to you, so I had no idea you could crouch for the entirety of my first playthrough. And the last 2 controller interactions that you have are, of course, the triangle button, which is used to do help actions when it tells you you can do them, and also used to cancel out of going through doors, and the L2 button, which you can use to ram people, the thing that cameramen are always doing. And the hitboxes are not great. As far as I could tell in my playthroughs, if the circle and square buttons do anything, I could not tell you what they could possibly be. It's a pretty pared back and in some ways quite weird set of controls. But with all the technicals out of the way, let's get into what Michigan Report from Hell is actually about.
There's a survivor in the center building. Let's go. Maybe we can get some leads on what's going on. But more importantly, somebody's in trouble.
You start out the game as a new cameraman working for Zaka TV, with your news team Briscoe and Pamela trying to find the perfect scoop. And make sure you get acquainted with this news team, because I'm sure you'll be with them for some time to come.
There's a
And stop thinking you can order me around. Huh?
Whoops. Well, now that monsters are killing people, your new goal is to get the hell out of Chicago, while still trying to find a good scoop if you can, and maybe answers to what is happening and why. It's unfortunate that Pamela has to die there, but you get a new reporter in the next scene named Anne, and she's who you'll be teamed up with for the rest of the game. Okay, what I meant to say is she can be a reporter for the rest of the game. Actually, one of the features of this game is that reporters can die and the game story keeps going. Which is kind of wild for a horror game in the year 2004. I think the game Obscure had a similar feature, but Michigan Report from Hell beat it to market by a few months, and in Obscure the multiple characters were essentially used as a live system. It's interesting because this type of design philosophy would be a selling point of supermassive games titles like Until Dawn about a decade later.
Until Dawn, only your choices determine who will survive. Exclusively on PS4.
As well as a few other companies and projects.
David Cage put out that bullshit article like 3 weeks before we start. No, 2 weeks before we started this, saying game overs are the failure of the game designer.
And this game does a rudimentary version of that. Not well, mind you, but it is here. So, in my first playthrough, Anne got killed by a spider because I didn't push her hard enough out of the way, and it skips, as I found out in my second playthrough, quite a bit to get you to the next reporter. After a bit, you do start to pick up on the fact that the reporter you have doesn't really impact that much, at least story-wise. They have slight variations on their personality, and some scenes play out slightly differently, but you'll still move on to the same locations in basically the same order no matter what you go with. They do all have their own unique voice lines, which is pretty impressive for the budget, but it doesn't really amount to too much in the end. The only reporter that everyone gets is Pamela at the very beginning, Anne after Pamela gets dragged away, and Nina in a section of the game that make you deal with Nina regardless of whatever else you've got going on. And before anyone that may be super familiar with the game comments, I know that Nina isn't technically a reporter. She is the girlfriend of a cameraman for a different Zaka TV crew named Dwight, but she fulfills the role of a reporter in your party at that point of the game. In my 2 playthroughs, I saw 4 of the 5 possible replacement reporters. The 5th is apparently an unkillable dude named Mark. I watched a bit of footage of him, and he definitely seems like a last resort placeholder. But it's not like any of the reporters are brimming with personality. Anne cares more about the scoop than anything else, and at will times chastise the player for acting to save her instead of filming a story. Carly is nice and peppy and wants to help people. Justine is a bit more sarcastic, spiky, and at times sultry. And Paula is, I think, supposed to be young and naive. As for Constance, I'll start with Briscoe, because he's the first character that you're gonna meet, and he's your sound guy through the entire game, and he cannot die. He is very suspicious at times, but he does chastise you if you choose to dispassionately film as horrible things are happening instead of helping. He's also kind of a coward, and when other people want to help or get to the bottom of things, definitely tries to go in kind of a runaway direction. He was also, evidently, in love with Pamela, and is visibly shaken by her death. And Pamela, to her credit, also encourages you to help people instead of filming them for the brief time that she's around. I mean, she mostly seems to want you to help her when she's in trouble, which you can't do in the systems of the game, but it seems like she would be cool with you helping other people as well. You just never really get to test that theory. You learn a little bit more about her and Briscoe's relationship when she comes back to show him her demon possession form. Or, at least you would learn a little bit more about her and Briscoe's relationship during that scene if you didn't skip that scene because, say, Anne died from a spider bite. It is the scene where you learn that Briscoe and Pamela were in some kind of relationship, or at very least that he was in love with her. Editor note: the scene where Briscoe says that he loves Pamela officially happens while he's playing the piano, which I actually did see in my first playthrough. What I missed with Pamela's return was the confirmation that she had turned into a demon. I am, however, a little disappointed I missed this scene in my first playthrough because it's a pretty cool piece of body horror. Most of the other characters don't show up till about halfway through the game or later, so I'll give a warning for the second half of the game now. The next important constant person you run into, besides one scene where you save Justine before she can join your party officially, is Nina. But while I did like Nina, I didn't find her all that interesting. You meet up with her during a section where whichever reporter you're traveling with goes to check on their family, leaving you and Briscoe to your own devices for a bit. Or, in the case of my first playthrough, when your reporter dies horribly to a boss demon, because you didn't know where the enemy would be coming from, and they told you to look up, so you kept trying to push her out of the way, a lesson that you learned from the spider that you failed to save Anne from, when you, of course, should have been looking at the ground to see that there were spawn crawling towards her to tell her to shoot.
Carly! 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 Oh my God!
Anyway, Nina is looking for her boyfriend Dwight, who is, of course, already dead, and she mostly exists to sacrifice herself during this encounter to give you another definitive death for Briscoe and maybe the cameraman to feel bad about, depending on what type of playthrough you're going for.
Monster! Damn it! Run! Never mind me.
What? We're not gonna leave you!
I can take this thing. Just get out of here! I'm all right. I've still got some bullets left. I'll make this thing blow up from inside.
Nina! Look out!
Before getting too deep into endgame stuff, you may realize that I had a lot of characters die in my first playthrough. I, at a certain point, realized that playthrough was kinda scuffed, and just let people die when they died in-game. By the end of the game, I ended up losing 2 reporters and 1 cameraman at random points, as well as all the people one would lose throughout the game played anyway. That cameraman death was super weird though. I just walked down some stairs into a basement, and then my screen blacked out, and suddenly I was playing a different guy looking at the body of my old cameraman. It didn't feel like there was a lot of warning either, like kind of a bullshit King's Quest death. And it's especially weird because at other points in the game when your main character dies, like, for example, when I was caught by this fucking thing that started randomly chasing me and I couldn't figure out how to outrun or kill it, you do get a game over. The one technically canon cameraman death I had was just kind of a weird anomaly that I was never able to recreate with anything else. That creature, by the way, completely optional encounter. You don't have to fight it at all. It's entirely dependent on what room you choose to sleep in the night before, And if you get a game over, it takes you to before you make that choice. So you can just choose to sleep in a different room and not have any encounter. I never did learn how to get past that encounter, either by running away or defeating the monster. Not even in my second playthrough. Which, speaking of my second playthrough...
I've had enough danger for one day. Thank you very much.
But he's been left behind and he's elderly.
I probably should have done an immoral playthrough for this one, but instead I decided that what I would try to do would be to keep Anne as my reporter through the whole game. So, I heroically saved her from the spider on the ceiling, and we moved on together, and I got to see the stuff I missed in my first playthrough. Okay, that's fine. I can just not save, and then I can just redo the level. That's perfectly fine. There's no issue. So I decided for my second playthrough that I would keep Carly through the whole game. I found out later that the solution to that was to hit a button on the right side of the wall that I did not see. But by that time I had already saved my game over the last file, and I was not going to start again for Anne, a reporter that I honestly wasn't that attached to. Things were, however, going pretty well with Carly. She lived past the boss fight she died at in my first playthrough, and we did split up for the Nina scene, but rejoined after and were cruising for a few sections. That is, until we were sent by the boss of the company, who may or may not know what was going on, but was definitely super cold about the fact that multiple people in her employ were dying to demon attacks, to get a few more people and maybe a few more scoops before escaping the city. It turns out, in this section, if you find another Zaka employee named Adonis in the forest building area, he has become infected and will transform into a demon immediately after being found. Most reporters will shoot him when prompted because he's going to attack them if they don't. Carly will abjectly refuse to shoot him, and will die if you open this locker, no matter what.
Robbie! Oh, Robbie! Oh, Robbie, I love you!
Come on, that's enough. Let's go.
Leaving you with Paula for the rest of the game. In my first playthrough, when I was doing objectively worse, dying earlier meant that my third reporter that I got was Justine. Justine was my favorite reporter of all of the temporary reporters. She had a good energy, a good rapport. I enjoyed playing the game with her.
You're fired, Briscoe.
Paula, on the other hand, was my least favorite of the temporary reporters, and I didn't feel like she had much chemistry with the cameraman or Briscoe at all. Now, I don't want to make too big a deal out of this. Like I said earlier, the difference between the best reporter and the worst one is pretty small. Their personalities are not super in-depth, they're all pretty paper-thin. But I just thought it was funny that in my first playthrough, when I was doing worse, I felt better about the things that were happening to me. And the final kicker here is that none of this really matters. Reporters dying does not impact your morality level enough to give you the immoral ending, unless it happens during a save event where you choose not to save them. So, let's talk about the mysteries behind this game. Where it all comes from, what is causing people to turn into demons? Is it the fog? Is it a curse? Is it this fucking guy, somehow? What are the answers here?
I'll tell you about it then. The monster that killed him is the military, the government, and Zaka Group.
I did say up front that this game is somewhat inspired by Stephen King's The Mist, and in that tradition, you don't get all the answers. You also don't get a super coherent storyline, but that's not a feature of The Mist, which rules. It's more a feature of early underground AA video games. Your boss at HQ seems to know something, but she also seems perplexed upon actually seeing the monsters when they attack her, and she tells you very little. Your entire conversation with her is basically spent appeasing you and telling you that she wants to get everyone out of Chicago. You get more answers from one Dr. O'Connor at the VIP area of a club that looks like a prison, who goes on a whole expository tirade about what's happening and who's responsible. He implicates the Zaka Group, the military, and himself, saying that it's a virus they developed together to use on enemies of the state, which the crew uses to deduce that it was released in a plane crash that happened recently. He's also suspicious as hell and talks about humans in a way that obviously doesn't include himself, which is not something any of the other infected do, but he's like doing a one with the virus type of thing. Then he turns into a demon, and you have a boss fight against him where you have to splash him with alcohol and electrocute him. On the topic of Dr. O'Connor, you also run into this guy later, who is the proponent of one of the best pieces of voice acting in the game, and the most prominent piece of voice acting I heard from this game before I started playing it.
Ow! That hurts! Don't kill me! Please don't kill me! But I suppose you have to. But...
He was Dr. O'Connor's lab rat, and possibly patient zero for the spread of the virus. You meet him somewhat randomly when he accosts you near the end of the game on your way to signal rescue. He acts bizarre, kind of ranting at you, not really knowing what's going on, and then he starts charging your reporter over and over again, giving you little choice but to shoot him. Hence the,
"But I suppose you have to,"
in that speech that he gives. His death also clears up the mist around, or at least coincides with the clearing up of the mist, which is kind of weird. And his death spreads around a bunch of leeches in a pretty cool CG, which visibly attack the cameraman, which seems not great for the spread of a virus, but the characters all seem okay with it, so I guess we're fine. There are also a bunch of hidden letters that you can find around to someone who they call D from someone who calls themselves M. None of them are like a smoking gun or anything, but they all refer vaguely to things that the two of them are trying to do. And in the last letter, M gets mad at D for knowing more than D told M. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that D is Deborah Flair, who is the boss of Zaka TV. I did not find all of these notes, so I might be missing something, but from what I could gather, these notes are just M reporting back to D, who has something to do with the things that are happening, which does partially confirm O'Connor's story, if nothing else. As for anything left unsolved, In 3 of the 4 endings, your character is, like, about to talk about the mysteries and who's behind everything when he's shot by an off-screen presence. And in the 4th ending, your character's like a demon who doesn't really seem to care one way or the other about how things got started. In every ending, before the credits, Briscoe does turn into a demon and chooses to jump out of the lighthouse that you are now on top of to sacrifice himself so he doesn't end up attacking you. So I apologize for being suspicious of Briscoe the whole time. He did a solid at the very end. Basically, if you're looking for more definitive answers than that, they're not gonna get them here. At least, not as far as I could deduce. Maybe they were in some of the 2D from M letters that I missed. But, ultimately, I was fine with the level of answers that were received. I wasn't super compelled by the mystery. I was more interested in kind of the moment-to-moment weirdness.
Just shut up and listen. And listen good, Chief. I, Jean-Philippe Briscoe, say this as a representative of all Zaka TV news teams. We refuse to get kicked around anymore.
My, this is fascinating.
I actually like quite a bit about Michigan Report from Hell, but I acknowledge that it's a hard recommendation. The game is extremely flawed, and the voice acting is straight up terrible. Which could be a benefit if you like campy, over-the-top, ridiculous voice acting. But the gameplay stuff is gonna be a much harder sell for some people. The game gets very frustrating at parts. But if you can look past that, I do think that there are interesting things about this game. I personally like a lot of B-movies, and games based on B-movies are 100% up my alley. And I can deal with a lot of jank for that. I also really like the central idea of playing as a cameraman, and what you choose to film or not affecting how the story plays out. I mean, I talked about the game Not for Broadcast in like one of my first things that I put out on this channel, and I really liked that game, and it did a very similar thing. To go back and talk about some of the gameplay stuff that I've mentioned, the controls are kinda scuffed and not super intuitive sometimes. The reporters solving all the puzzles for you can be a bit boring and frustrating at times, especially when that same reporter can't figure out to shoot little demon mites that are crawling towards her without your intervention. And there's a fair amount of things that will kill you or a reporter that feel a little unfair. Something you may have also noticed is that this game looks bad graphically. I don't want to compare this to like Halo 2 or GTA San Andreas, which came out the same year, because it is a budget title and those are some of the most expensive games at the time. But it's worth pointing out that this was not what most stuff looked like in 2004 or anything. This was definitely janky budget graphics for the time. The art direction doesn't do the game a lot of favors either, with one notable exception, and that is that I do think some of the body horror CG looks kinda cool. Briscoe's transformation at the very end of the game, in particular, I think works as a genuinely interesting scene visually. It's still not polished, but I think it looks bad in more of an uncanny way than a cheap, silly way like most of the rest of the game does. At least that's my opinion. It picks up in these scenes a little bit of the B-movie magic that some of the things that inspired it might have. Speaking of horror, I can think of at least one genuinely kinda tense moment in this game, which you might not expect from most of the rest of this game. It just needed to set the scene to happen, and by set the scene, I mean get rid of these two chuckle fucks hanging around. When you first get to the nightclub where you meet Dr. O'Connor, everything is completely dark. So your reporter and Briscoe can't see around, so they can't come with you to do stuff. Only you can see because you have what they call an infrared camera. It's not infrared, I think it's night vision. Either way, you have the ability to see kind of in the dark, and they don't. So you have to go and search for the breaker to turn the lights back on. I wasn't sure where to go, so I was just wandering around in the dark for a bit, and the game puts a lot of implication out that things are watching you. And it actually turns into a pretty effective little sequence until you find the breaker. I particularly enjoyed this flavor text when you interact with this door here. I'm not saying any of this is particularly sophisticated horror, like, oh, to build tension, you just need to not have Briscoe actively negating the tension by commenting on how much he dislikes the wall art.
Huh. A kid could paint a picture like that.
But it is a neat little moment that I thought was actually kind of tense. I want to make it clear. I've made a few jokes about this game's tone, because this game's tone is very silly. Those are not criticisms, though. This game is not trying to be Silent Hill 2 or Rule of Rose. It's not trying to be the most horrifying experience you're gonna have on the PS2 or anything. It is a very silly B-movie type experience, and I personally enjoy that a great deal. And ultimately, you're either gonna like that or you're not. For me, stuff like the bad voice acting and goofy graphics really add to the vibe of the game. Especially the voice acting, honestly. It's considered some of the worst voice acting of all time, but if it weren't for how insane the voice acting in this game is, I probably wouldn't have heard about this game, or at least wouldn't until years later. I appreciate the swings that early 2000s voice acting took, with all of its cracks. Michigan Report from Hell is a goofy fun time. I definitely do not recommend running out and trying to get a $500 physical copy of this game, but if you do acquire this game by any means, whatever means you acquire it by, I do suggest checking it out. It's fun. You'll get a couple laughs if nothing else, even if you are a little frustrated by the end of your time with it. This is not like YouTube clickbait, the best PS2 horror game you've never heard of, or anything like that. There are a lot of really good horror games on the PS2. If you want a genuine, tense, scary experience, I'm playing Haunting Grounds right now, and while there are some frustrations with it, it has really good horror vibes. I also recommend Rule of Rose, Silent Hill 2 and 3, Fatal Frame 1 and 2. Hell, I did a video on The Suffering last year, and I could see that game being very scary for people depending on what they respond to in horror. I could go on. The PS2 is one of the best systems for survival horror ever. But if you were looking for a campy, fun B horror vibe, you could do a lot worse than Michigan Report from Hell.
You're gonna change clothes now? We're in a hurry.
It'll only take a second. And it'll be nice for our viewers. Ah! A dead body?
Serves you right.
What are you laughing about? That would startle anyone.
Yeah. I'm sorry. But let's just hurry up and start looking.
Remember that time way back when I kissed a guy who ate his women friends? Now only dogs will follow me. Is he following? I bite at the hand that feeds me, slap at the face that eats me. Some kind of animal cannibal made impressions on me. Have we met before? Possibly in Michigan, in some strange department store.